she cried. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt." The entire restaurant froze. Then a chair scraped the marble, slow, deliberate, and every soul in that room turned toward the shadowed booth where a man in a charcoal suit was rising. When his eyes met hers, something ancient and dangerous shifted in the air, and the man about to hurt her realized too late who he'd just touched. If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. Jean-Louis pressed her trembling hands against the polished edge of the bar at La Vela, her white blouse stained with Cabernet Sauvignon that still dripped from her wrist. At 31, she'd mastered the art of swallowing humiliation. It was survival, not weakness, working double shifts at an upscale restaurant where a single entree cost more than her weekly groceries. Her fingers ached as she reached for a towel, but not from the wine. It was from the grip of the man who'd grabbed her wrist like she was property, not a person. The burn came from his words, not the spill. Maybe if trash like you learned your place, you wouldn't be wiping up after your betters. She didn't know that in the dimly lit corner booth, partially obscured by the flicker of candlelight and the gentle hum of piano music, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit had stopped cutting his steak mid-bite. Thomas Denaro, his name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with equal parts reverence and terror, sat motionless, but his jaw had tightened in a way that made the air around him feel dangerous. The wine had been an accident, a genuine stumble as Jean navigated between tables during the busiest hour of Saturday evening. A few drops, nothing more, had landed on Richard Hale's sleeve, but he'd erupted like she'd committed an assault. Grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks, shoved her backward so she collided with an empty chair. The restaurant's ambient noise, the murmur of conversation, the delicate clink of crystal glasses, the soft notes of a piano in the corner, had evaporated into stunned silence. Jean had tried to apologize, tried to clean the spill with shaking hands, her voice cracking with each, "I'm sorry." But Richard had stood, his face red with manufactured rage, his expensive shoes gleaming under the chandelier light as he raised one foot above her kneeling form. That's when she'd said it. That's when Jean-Louis, on her hands and knees in front of 50 witnesses who'd turned their faces away in collective cowardice, had whispered the words that would shatter the night. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt." The entire restaurant froze. The piano player's fingers stuttered. A waiter dropped a tray somewhere in the kitchen. Even the flames in the candles seemed to still. Richard Hale hesitated, his foot suspended in the air, his expression caught between satisfaction and uncertainty. He glanced around at the watching faces, some horrified, others carefully neutral. No one moved, no one spoke. He lowered his foot slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Get up," he said coldly, "and bring me another bottle, the same vintage, and this time, try not to..." The scrape of a chair against marble cut through his words. Slow, deliberate, final. Every head in La Vela turned toward table 12, toward the corner booth where shadows gathered thick, where a man in a charcoal suit and no tie was rising to his full height. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, but there was something in the way he stood that made the air itself feel heavier. Thomas Denaro straightened his cuffs, adjusted his collar. His tattooed fingers, marks of a past that couldn't be erased, caught the light as he moved. His face was perfectly calm, expressionless, but his eyes, dark, ancient, carrying the weight of 1,000 violent decisions, were fixed on Richard Hale with the focus of a predator that had just identified its prey. He took one step forward, then another. Each footfall echoed in the silence like a judge's gavel. An older waiter near the bar went pale, his hands beginning to shake. He recognized that walk, that face, that presence. Someone at a nearby table whispered 2 words, barely audible but carrying through the room like a death sentence. "That's Denaro." Richard Hale's confident sneer began to crack at the edges. His eyes darted left, then right, searching for allies, for witnesses, for anyone who might intervene. But everyone in La Vela had suddenly found something fascinating about their plates. Thomas stopped 3 feet away from Richard, close enough that the businessman had to tilt his head up slightly to maintain eye contact, close enough that Richard could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne, mixed with something darker, something that spoke of violence held on a very short leash. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried through the restaurant like thunder. "Get your foot off her, before I break it." The world didn't stop. It simply forgot how to breathe. Richard Hale's mouth opened, then closed. His foot still hovering near Jean's trembling form lowered slowly to the ground, not out of mercy, but out of something far more primal. Survival instinct, recognizing a predator when it was close enough to smell. Thomas DeNaro didn't blink, didn't move. He simply stood there, his presence filling the space between them like gathering storm clouds, dark and inevitable. The silence stretched. A wine glass trembled in someone's hand at table 4. A woman's breath caught audibly near the window. The piano player's fingers hovered above the keys, frozen mid-note, as if pressing down might shatter whatever fragile piece still existed in the room. Jeanne remained on the floor, her palms pressed against the cold marble, fragments of broken glass glittering around her like fallen stars. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why this stranger had stood up, why his voice had carried such quiet, terrifying authority. She only knew that the air had changed, that danger had entered the room wearing an expensive suit. Thomas's eyes never left Richard's face. In his mind, a memory surfaced unbidden but sharp as yesterday. His mother's voice, hoarse from illness, her thin hand gripping his. "Tommy, you'll have power one day, more than most men dream of. But power without mercy makes you no better than the people you fear. Promise me you'll remember the difference." He'd been 17. She died 2 weeks later. That promise had been the first rule of the empire he'd built. Never touch the innocent. It was a rule his enforcers knew by heart, a line drawn in blood that even his enemies respected. Because Thomas DeNaro kept his word whether that word was a promise or a threat, and Richard Hale had just crossed that line in front of him. "I said," Thomas repeated, his voice dropping even lower, each word measured and deliberate. "Get your foot off her." Richard's face flushed. She spilled wine on a $3,000 suit. She should what?" Thomas interrupted. The interruption was soft, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "Should beg? Should kneel while you decide whether to show mercy?" He tilted his head slightly, studying Richard like a specimen. "Is that what makes you feel like a man?" The businessman's bravado was crumbling in real time. His eyes darted toward the exit, calculating distance. But Thomas's 2 associates, men who'd been sitting quietly at separate tables, dressed like ordinary diners, had already stood and positioned themselves near the door. Not blocking it. Not yet. Just present. Thomas took 1 step closer, and Richard instinctively stepped back, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass. "Do you know who I am?" Richard tried, his voice climbing an octave. "I have lawyers. You have nothing I care about," Thomas said simply. Then he did something that made every witness in that restaurant lean forward slightly, drawn by the unexpected gentleness of it. He knelt. His charcoal suit touched the floor where wine and water pooled. His tattooed hand, the same hand that had signed orders that made grown men disappear, extended toward Jean, with his palm up, open, offering. "No one touches you again," he murmured. His words meant only for her. Jean stared at his hand, then up at his face. This close, she could see the faint scar along his jawline, the silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples, the eyes that held both darkness and something achingly human. She didn't know whether to take his hand or run from it, but her body, exhausted and humiliated, made the choice for her. Her trembling fingers touched his palm. His hand closed around hers, firm but careful, as if he understood exactly how fragile she felt in this moment. He helped her rise slowly, steadying her when her legs wobbled, his other hand briefly touching her elbow to keep her upright. When she was standing, when she'd found her balance, Thomas released her and turned back to Richard Hale. The transformation was instant. The gentleness vanished. His expression hardened into something ancient and unforgiving. "Apologies, Thomas said. Richard's face went from pale to scarlet. "For what?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "For forgetting what it means to be human." The restaurant held its breath. Richard Hale's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for allies, for witnesses who might testify to the absurdity of this demand. But every face in La Vela had turned away, suddenly fascinated by their cooling meals, their half-empty wine glasses, the intricate pattern of the tablecloths. "I don't," Richard began, his voice cracking. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to." Thomas didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. He simply took 1 step closer, eliminating what little space remained between them, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Say it," Thomas whispered. But somehow, everyone heard. The seconds stretched like hours. Jean stood frozen beside them, her hand still tingling where his touch had been rough calluses and old scars, but surprising warmth. She wanted to tell him it was okay, that she didn't need this, that she just wanted to disappear into the kitchen and pretend this night had never happened. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. Because part of her, a part she'd buried under years of swallowed pride and quiet endurance, did need this. Needed to hear that what had happened to her was wrong. Needed someone to see her as more than just collateral damage in Richard Hale's performance of power. Richard's face had gone from scarlet to ash gray. His hands trembled at his sides. When he finally spoke, the words tumbled out broken and small. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I apologize. The apology was directed at the floor, barely audible. To her, Thomas said softly. Look at her when you speak. Richard's eyes lifted, meeting Jean's for the first time that night, really meeting them, seeing her as a person instead of a function. And in that moment, Jean saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine fear. Not of Thomas, though that was certainly there, but fear of what he'd become, what he'd revealed about himself in front of all these witnesses. I'm sorry, Richard said again, his voice steadier this time, his gaze holding hers. For everything. I was wrong. Jean nodded once, unable to trust her voice, unable to process the surreal reversal of this moment. Minutes ago, she'd been on the floor, begging not to be kicked. Now, a man who terrified her was apologizing while another man, a stranger, stood beside her like an avenging angel in a charcoal suit. Thomas studied Richard for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. His two associates materialized from their positions, flanking Richard without touching him. These gentlemen will help you find the exit, Thomas said calmly. Your tab has been covered. You won't be returning to La Vela. It wasn't a request. Richard understood that immediately. He glanced once more at Jean, something that might have been shame flickering across his face, then allowed himself to be escorted toward the door. His exit was silent except for the soft fall of his footsteps on marble, each step an erasure of his presence from this space. The door closed behind them with a gentle click that echoed like a gunshot. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then Thomas turned to face the restaurant, his voice carrying clearly. Dinner is on me tonight. All of you. He gestured to the maitre d', who nodded frantically. And this restaurant, he paused, his eyes sweeping across the stunned faces, is now under my protection. Anyone who works here, anyone who dines here, will be treated with respect. Or they'll answer to me. A collective exhale rippled through the room. The piano player's fingers found the keys again, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Conversation resumed in hushed tones, punctuated by nervous laughter and the clink of silverware on china. Thomas turned back to Jean, his expression softening in a way that seemed almost painful for him, as if gentleness required more effort than violence ever had. Are you hurt? He asked quietly. Jean shook her head, then immediately reconsidered. My wrist, she admitted, holding it up. Purple bruises were already blooming where Richard had grabbed her. Thomas's jaw tightened, but his touch remained gentle as he examined the injury without making contact. Ice it tonight. If it's still swollen tomorrow, see a doctor. Send me the bill. I don't even know who you are, Jean whispered. Something flickered in his dark eyes, amusement maybe, or sadness. Better that way, he said. Then he walked back to table 12, sat down, and resumed eating his steak as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The rest of Jean's shift passed in a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. Other servers approached her with cautious sympathy, asking if she was okay, their eyes darting nervously toward table 12, where the man in the charcoal suit ate in perfect silence. The manager, Vincent, a reed-thin man who normally treated staff like replaceable machinery, brought her water and told her she could leave early if she needed to. She didn't leave. Couldn't afford to. Every hour mattered when rent was due in 3 days. But when midnight finally arrived, when the last customers had filtered out into the November cold, and the kitchen staff had clocked out through the back entrance, Jean found herself lingering. She'd changed out of her wine-stained uniform into her street clothes, faded jeans, and an oversized jacket that had seen better years, but something kept her feet rooted to the employee corridor. She needed to understand what had happened. Needed to know why a stranger had stood up for her when no one else would. The back door opened onto an alley where steam rose from grates, and a single flickering streetlight painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. Jean leaned against the brick wall, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and let the tears she'd been holding finally fall. Not from pain, from exhaustion, from the weight of being seen and invisible at the same time, from years of swallowing indignity because the alternative was homelessness. Rough night. Jean's head snapped up. Thomas Denaro stood at the alley entrance, his hands in his pockets, his expensive suit somehow looking perfectly natural against the grimy backdrop of dumpsters and fire escapes. Up close, in the harsh streetlight, she could see more of him, the silver at his temples, the faint scars tracing his knuckles, the way his eyes carried the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much. You shouldn't be here, Jean said, wiping her eyes quickly. I mean, thank you. For what you did. But I don't. I can't get involved with whatever you are. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Smart. Most people aren't that smart. They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the city filling the space between them. Sirens, car horns, the rumble of a late-night train. Do you remember a cafe on 9th Street? Thomas asked suddenly, his voice softer now. Angelo's. Jean frowned, caught off guard by the question. Yes. I worked there years ago. 5, maybe 6 years? It closed after Mr. Angelo passed away. Her chest tightened with the memory. That place. It felt like home. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze distant. My mother used to eat there, every Thursday morning. Said there was a waitress who always smiled, even when she looked like she hadn't slept in days. A waitress who gave her free soup once when she didn't have enough money. Jean's breath caught. She remembered. A cold December morning, a woman with kind eyes and worn clothes, counting coins on the counter with shaking hands. Jean had lied, told her the soup was on special, that it was already paid for. The woman had cried and told her that kindness had saved her life that day. That was my mother, Thomas said quietly. Eleanor Denaro. The name hit Jean like a physical blow. She'd heard it before whispered in news reports, mentioned in the same breath as organized crime and federal investigations. Eleanor Denaro, the matriarch whose death 5 years ago had supposedly been the last piece of humanity in the Denaro Empire. Your mother, Jean whispered, her mind racing. The woman with the gray coat, the one who always ordered minestrone. She told me about you, Thomas continued, his voice thick with something Jean couldn't quite identify. Grief, maybe, or regret. Said you gave without asking anything in return, that you smiled at her like she mattered when the rest of the world looked right through her. He paused, his jaw working. She passed away a week later. Heart attack. But her last words were about that waitress, about the girl who reminded her that there was still kindness in the world. Jean's hand flew to her mouth. Tears streamed freely now, hot against her cold cheeks. I looked for you, Thomas said, for years, and tonight, when I saw you on that floor. His voice cracked, just barely, but enough. I realized I'd found you. Jean couldn't process it. Her mind kept circling back to that December morning, the woman's trembling hands, the grateful tears, the way she'd squeezed Jean's fingers and whispered, You don't know what you've done for me today. She'd been Eleanor Denaro, the mother of the man now standing in front of her, the man whose name made politicians nervous and whose protection apparently meant something in this city. I don't understand, Jean said, her voice breaking. That was just... It was soup. It wasn't anything special. It was everything, Thomas interrupted gently. My mother had been on the streets for 3 months. She'd left my father left the life because she couldn't watch what we were becoming anymore. She was trying to stay clean, trying to find herself again, but she was dying slowly, starving herself because she was too proud to ask me for help. His jaw clenched. That soup, that smile you gave her? She came home that night, told me there was still good in the world worth living for. Jean shook her head, overwhelmed. But she died a week later. I didn't save her. You gave her 1 more week of believing in humanity, Thomas said, his dark eyes holding hers. 1 more week where she didn't give up entirely. She got to tell me she loved me, got to make me promise I'd try to be better than what my father raised me to be. He looked away, his voice dropping. Without that week, I never would have heard those words. Never would have understood what she was trying to teach me all along. The weight of it settled over Jean like snow, silent, heavy, transformative. She leaned back against the cold brick wall, her legs suddenly weak. You don't owe me anything. I didn't know. I was just trying to be decent. Exactly, Thomas said. You were decent when you had every reason not to be. My mother told me you worked 3 shifts that week, that your coat was held together with safety pins, that you gave away food you probably needed yourself. He stepped closer, and Jean saw something raw in his expression, gratitude mixed with guilt. I owe you everything. No, Jean insisted, her voice firm despite the tears. You don't repay kindness like it's a debt. That's not how it works. Your mother. Jean's throat tightened. She was a beautiful person. She deserved that soup. She deserved to be seen. And so do you, Thomas said quietly. The words hung between them in the cold November air. Jean wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how small she felt, how exposed. All her life, she'd been invisible by necessity. Blend in, keep your head down, don't make waves. Being seen, truly seen, felt terrifying. I don't know what you want from me, she whispered. Nothing, Thomas said immediately. I want nothing from you, Jean, but I want to give you something. A choice. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You spend your life taking care of people who don't see you, who treat you like furniture. I watched it for 3 weeks, the way they snap their fingers, the way they speak over you, the way they leave exact change like you should be grateful for scraps. Jean flinched at the accuracy of it. What if you didn't have to live like that anymore? Thomas asked. What if you could work somewhere that valued you? Somewhere safe? There's no such place, Jean said automatically. Not for people like me. There could be, Thomas said. If someone built it. Jean studied his face, searching for the trap, the angle, the thing that would make sense of why a man like him cared about a woman like her. But all she saw was sincerity, painful, uncomfortable sincerity from someone who clearly wasn't used to showing it. Why? She asked simply. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. Because my mother's last wish was that I use my power for something other than fear. Because you showed her mercy when no one else would. And because tonight, when you were on that floor begging not to be kicked, his voice hardened. I saw my mother, and I remembered what mercy looks like. If this moment hit you in the chest, if you believe kindness still matters in a cruel world, don't scroll. Subscribe right now, before the world makes you forget how it feels. The video went viral within 18 hours. Someone at La Vella had filmed the confrontation's shaky phone footage that captured the moment Thomas Denaro stood up, the way Richard Hale's face had drained of color, Jean's whispered plea echoing through the restaurant's stunned silence. By Monday morning, it had 3 million views. By Tuesday, every news outlet in the city was running the story. Mafia boss defends Waitress in shocking restaurant confrontation. Thomas Denaro's unlikely act of mercy, redemption or PR stunt. Viral video shows alleged crime lord standing up to abusive customer. Jean watched her phone blow up with notifications texts from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Friend requests from strangers. News outlets requesting interviews. Her face, frozen in that moment of terror and vulnerability, was being shared across every social media platform. Some comments praised her dignity. Others accused her of staging the incident, and still others speculated about her connections to organized crime. She'd called in sick to work, unable to face the restaurant, unable to imagine walking through those doors again, but staying home felt like hiding, and hiding felt like admission of guilt for something she hadn't done. On Wednesday morning, someone knocked on her apartment door. Jean peered through the peephole and saw a woman in an expensive pantsuit holding a manila folder. Press. Had to be. She'd already ignored calls from 6 different reporters. Miss Lewis, the woman called through the door. I'm not a journalist. Mr. Denaro sent me. I'm his attorney. Jean's stomach dropped. She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain engaged. I don't need a lawyer. The woman mid-40s, with sharp eyes and an air of unshakable competence, smiled patiently. You will. The media narrative is shifting. Some outlets are suggesting you work for the Denaro organization. Others are implying you deliberately provoked Mr. Hale to create this situation. My job is to protect you from defamation and ensure your safety. I can't afford. You're not paying. The attorney interrupted gently. Mr. Denaro is handling all legal fees. He wants you to know that you're protected. Legally, financially, physically. Jean felt her chest tighten. I never asked for this. I know, the woman said, but that's the cost of being connected to him even tangentially. The world wants to understand why Thomas Denaro, a man known for ruthlessness, intervened for a waitress. And until they find an answer that satisfies them, they'll keep digging into your life. That afternoon, Jean learned exactly how deep the digging went. A tabloid published an article about her son, 8-year-old Marcus, whose father had left before he was born. They'd found his school photos, speculated about his safety in proximity to organized crime figures, questioned whether Jean was a fit mother given her new associations. Jean read the article with shaking hands, her vision blurring with tears of rage and helplessness. They were dragging her child into this, making him collateral damage in a story he had nothing to do with. She called the only number she had for Thomas Denaro, the one his attorney had left. He answered on the second ring. They're writing about my son, Jean said, her voice cracking. They've published his picture, his school. I never wanted this. I never asked you to. I know, Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I've seen it. It's being handled. Handled how? Jean demanded. You can't threaten journalists. You can't make this disappear. I'm not part of your world. I don't want this protection if it means my son becomes a target. Silence on the other end. Then, meet me. Tonight. Same place as before. I can't keep. Jean, Thomas interrupted, and something in his tone made her pause. I understand your fear, but running from this won't protect Marcus. The story exists now. The only way through is forward. Trust me. I don't trust you, Jean said honestly. I don't even know you. Then let me give you a reason to, Thomas replied. One meeting. If you still want me gone from your life after that, I disappear. You'll never hear from me again. But let me show you what I'm offering before you refuse it. Jean closed her eyes, thinking of Marcus, of the leaked photos, of the reporters who might show up at his school, of the life she'd worked so hard to build now crumbling around her. Where? She whispered. La Vela. 9 o'clock. The restaurant is closed tonight. Just us. La Vela looked different in darkness. The chandelier lights were dimmed to a soft glow, casting long shadows across empty tables draped in white linen. No piano music, no murmur of conversation, just silence and the distant hum of the city through triple-paned windows. Jean stood in the entrance, her hand still on the door handle, every instinct screaming at her to leave. But Thomas sat at table 12, his usual corner booth, 2 espresso cups waiting on the table, steam rising in delicate spirals. Thank you for coming, he said, rising as she approached. The gesture felt oddly old-fashioned, almost courtly. Jean sat across from him, her jacket still on, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. You said you'd explain. So explain. Thomas pushed one of the espresso cups toward her. The owner of La Vela is selling. He's 73, his children want nothing to do with the restaurant business, and the building's lease is up for renewal in 60 days. He paused, watching her reaction. I'm buying it. Jean blinked. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to run it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jean laughed a sharp, disbelieving sound. Run it? I'm a waitress, not a manager. I don't know anything about it. You know everything that matters, Thomas interrupted. You know what it's like to work until your feet bleed, to smile through disrespect, to serve people who treat you like you're invisible. He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense. You know what this industry does to people like you. That makes you exactly the person who should be running a place that does things differently. Jean shook her head. This is insane. You can't just hand someone a restaurant because... I'm not handing you anything, Thomas said firmly. You'll work for it. Learn the business. Prove yourself. But you'll do it somewhere safe. Somewhere that pays a living wage. Somewhere that treats staff like human beings instead of servants. He paused. I'm offering you a chance to build something better than what broke you. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of possibility spreading outward. Jean wanted to refuse immediately, to walk away from this surreal offer and return to the predictable misery of her current life. But she thought of Marcus, of the tabloid photos, of 3 jobs that still didn't cover rent. What's the catch? She asked quietly. The catch, Thomas said, is that people will assume you're connected to me. They'll call you my associate, my employee, maybe worse. The restaurant will be seen as Denaro-owned even though your name will be on all the paperwork. Some customers won't come because of that association. Others will come precisely because of it. And you? Jean asked. What do you get out of this? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his espresso cup. My mother wanted me to use my power for something other than fear. She believed that the empire I built could become something more than what my father made it. He looked up, meeting Jean's eyes. This is my first attempt at proving she was right. Jean studied his face, the scars, the weariness, the unexpected vulnerability. Why a restaurant? Because food is communion, Thomas said simply. It's how families gather, how strangers become friends. My mother used to say that you can judge a society by how it treats people who serve food. If the servers are respected, the society is healthy. If they're invisible, he trailed off. I want to create a place where no one is invisible. Jean felt tears prickling at her eyes. It was too much, too big, too impossible, too far from anything she'd ever imagined for herself. I have a son. He's 8. If I do this, if I'm associated with you, what does that mean for him? It means he'll have a mother who doesn't work 3 jobs. Who can afford his school supplies without choosing between that and groceries? Who can be there when he comes home instead of running to the next shift? Thomas's voice softened. It means he'll see his mother build something instead of just survive. Jean's hands trembled around her cup. And if I say no? Then I disappear from your life, like I promised. The legal fees are covered regardless. You owe me nothing. Thomas met her gaze steadily. But Jean, you'll still be working at places like this, still swallowing indignity, still invisible. And if I say yes? Thomas smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. Then we change everything. Jean said yes. Not immediately. Not that night in the empty restaurant with Thomas Denaro watching her across the table like a man who just offered salvation and expected nothing in return. She'd gone home, held Marcus while he slept, and thought about what kind of mother she wanted to be. The kind who played it safe and stayed invisible, or the kind who took a chance on something better, even if it came wrapped in danger? She called Thomas the next morning. "I'll do it, but I have conditions." "Name them," he'd said. "Marcus comes first, always. If this puts him in danger, I walk away. No arguments." "Agreed. I run the restaurant my way. You fund it, but you don't control it. The staff, the menu, the culture that's mine." A pause. Then, "Agreed. And one more thing," Jean had said, her voice stronger now. "No illegal activity. I don't care what you do with the rest of your empire. But Eleanor's table," she'd used the name, Thomas suggested, honoring his mother, "stays clean. Completely clean." "That was always the plan," Thomas had replied, something like respect warming his tone. 3 months passed in a blur of transformation. The restaurant closed for renovations. Jean worked alongside Thomas's project manager, learning the business side while maintaining her dignity. She studied profit margins, supplier contracts, staff management. She interviewed every potential employee herself, prioritizing single mothers, former foster youth, people who'd been chewed up by the service industry and needed a second chance. The restaurant began to take shape: warmer lighting, comfortable booths, an open kitchen where cooks were visible and valued. Jean insisted on a board where customers could pay meals forward, where community mattered more than exclusivity. Thomas visited weekly, always sitting at table 12, always drinking black coffee. He never interfered, never questioned her decisions. He simply watched her build something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. Jean had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Then came the night that shattered everything. It was a Tuesday in March, unseasonably cold, when Jean stayed late to review the final menu before the grand reopening scheduled for Friday. The restaurant was dark, except for her office light. She was alone, or thought she was. The first sound was glass breaking, front entrance, then voices, multiple men, speaking in clipped tones that suggested military precision, or worse. Jean's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her phone, but before she could dial, her office door burst open. 3 men in dark clothing. No masks, they didn't need them. The leader, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, smiled coldly. "Jean Lewis, we've been waiting to meet you. What do you want?" Jean managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "To send Denaro a message," the man said. "He's been getting soft, turning legitimate. Some people in our organization think he's forgotten what business he's really in." He stepped closer. "You're the reason. His little redemption project." Jean's mind raced. Thomas had warned her this might happen, that rivals would see Eleanor's table as weakness, as something that could be exploited. He'd offered security, guards, protection. She'd refused, insisting the restaurant remain normal, unthreatening. Now she realized how naive that had been. "He'll pay for your safety," the scarred man continued. "Or, we make an example of what happens when bosses lose focus. Your choice." Jean's hand found the panic button Thomas had installed under her desk, one concession to security she'd agreed to. She pressed it silently, praying his people would arrive in time. "You don't want to do this," Jean said, buying time. "Whatever you think killing me accomplishes." "Who said anything about killing?" The man laughed. "We're professionals. We'll just hurt you enough that Denaro remembers why fear matters more than kindness." The scarred man moved forward. The office window exploded inward. Thomas Denaro came through it like something from a nightmare, all controlled violence and focused rage. He hit the ground, rolling, glass shards glittering in his hair, and came up with a gun already drawn. "Nobody moves," he said quietly. The 3 men froze. The scarred leader's hand drifted toward his waistband, but Thomas's gun shifted a fraction of an inch. The message clear. "Try it and die. Walk away," Thomas said. "Now, while I'm still asking nicely." "You've gone soft, Denaro," the scarred man said. "Over a waitress. The families are laughing at you." "Let them laugh," Thomas replied. "I'd rather be laughed at than become what you are, a coward who threatens unarmed women to prove he's strong." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Jean pressed herself against the far wall, her breath coming in short gasps. She could see the calculation in the scarred man's eyes, weighing pride against survival. Then backup arrived, Thomas's enforcers flooding through the broken entrance, weapons drawn, forming a perimeter that made resistance suicidal. The scarred man raised his hand slowly. "This isn't over." "Yes," Thomas said, his voice carrying absolute finality. "It is. Tell whoever sent you that Eleanor's table is untouchable. Anyone who comes here, anyone who threatens the people under this roof, answers to me personally." He stepped closer to the scarred man. "And tell them Thomas Denaro hasn't gone soft. He's just learned to pick battles worth fighting." The men were escorted out, not killed, Jean noticed, spared. Another statement about who Thomas was becoming. When they were gone, when the restaurant was secured and police had been paid off to file the report as attempted robbery, Thomas finally lowered his gun. His shoulder was bleeding. He'd been shot entering through the window, Jean realized. The adrenaline had hidden the wound. "You're hurt," Jean said, moving toward him. Thomas looked down at his shoulder as if noticing it for the first time. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Jean insisted, her hands trembling as she pressed her cardigan against the wound. "You could have died." "So could you?" Thomas said, his eyes finding hers. "I won't let that happen. Ever." Jean looked up at this man, this dangerous, broken, impossible man who'd just thrown himself through a window to save her, who'd been shot protecting a dream that wasn't even his own. "Please don't kick me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm already hurt." But this time, the words meant something different. This time, they were about vulnerability, about letting someone see the pain she usually hid, about trust. Thomas's uninjured arm wrapped around her gently, pulling her close. "No one touches you," he murmured against her hair. "Not while I'm breathing." If you felt your chest tighten when she repeated those words, don't just feel it and scroll. Subscribe, so stories like this keep reminding the world that compassion still wins. 6 months transformed everything. Eleanor's table opened on a Friday in late spring, with none of the pretension of La Vella but all of its beauty. The interior glowed with warm Edison bulbs and exposed brick, comfortable booths upholstered in deep burgundy, an open kitchen where Jean had hired 3 formerly incarcerated cooks who needed a second chance. The menu featured comfort food elevated with care, her mother's pozole recipe, Thomas's mother's minestrone, dishes that told stories of survival and love. But what made Eleanor's table different wasn't the food or the decor. It was the culture Jean built into its foundation. Every employee started at $22 an hour, unheard of in the industry. Full health care after 30 days, paid sick leave, childcare stipends for parents, a dignity clause in every contract that protected staff from customer abuse. 3 strikes and patrons were permanently banned, no matter how much money they had. The community board Jean had envisioned became the restaurant's heart. Customers could purchase meals for others, sometimes specific people, sometimes anonymous gifts for whoever needed them. Within a month, the board was covered with colored cards, blue for paid-forward meals, gold for thank-you notes, red for requests from struggling families. Thomas kept his promise. He funded everything but controlled nothing. His name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. Jean was listed as sole proprietor, though everyone in the city knew the truth. Thomas Denaro's money had built this place. His protection kept it safe. His mother's memory gave it purpose. The opening night was packed. Local press, food critics, curious citizens who wanted to see what a mob-funded social experiment looked like. Jean moved through the dining room in a simple black dress, no longer a uniform but a choice, greeting customers with genuine warmth. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the architect of something meaningful. Thomas sat at table 12. Of course, always table 12. He wore a dark suit, no tie, his silver-streaked hair catching the light. But tonight, he wasn't alone. 2 of his top associates sat with him, men whose faces regularly appeared in federal surveillance photos, now eating minestrone and discussing the Warriors game like suburban dads. Jean approached their table during a quiet moment, her heart full of gratitude and terror in equal measure. "How is everything?" "Perfect," Thomas said simply, his eyes holding hers for a beat longer than necessary. "Your mother would be proud." "Yours too," Jean replied softly. As the night progressed, Jean noticed the diversity of her clientele. Families with young children shared tables with elderly couples. A group of nurses still in scrubs celebrated someone's birthday. 2 men in expensive suits sat near a single mother and her teenage son. The restaurant had become what Jean dreamed it could be, a place where humanity mattered more than hierarchy. Around 9 p.m., a woman approached Jean near the kitchen, mid-50s, wearing a threadbare coat, her eyes red-rimmed and cautious. "Excuse me," the woman said quietly. "I saw the board, the one with the meal cards. Is that real? People really pay for strangers?" Jean smiled. "Very real. Are you hungry?" The woman's composure cracked. I haven't eaten in 2 days. Lost my job last month. Too proud to ask my kids for help. She trailed off, embarrassed. Jean gently guided her to a booth. What's your name? Patricia. Patricia. Tonight you're my guest. Order whatever you'd like. And Jean pulled a gold card from her pocket, the kind given to paying it forward donors. When you're back on your feet, if you want to help someone else the way we're helping you tonight, this is how. Patricia cried into her napkin while Jean ordered her the pozole and fresh bread. When the food arrived, steaming and fragrant, Patricia looked up with tears streaming down her face. Why are you doing this? Because someone once did it for me, Jean said, thinking of Thomas's mother, of a bowl of soup given without expectation, and because everyone deserves to eat with dignity. From table 12, Thomas watched the interaction. His associate, Marco, followed his gaze and chuckled. You're getting soft, boss. Restaurant charity now? Thomas didn't look away from Jean. There are different kinds of power, Marco. The kind that makes people fear you, and the kind that makes people follow you because they believe in what you're building. He finally turned to his associate. I've had enough fear for one lifetime. By midnight, when the last customer had left and the staff was cleaning up, Jean found Thomas still at table 12, his black coffee long cold. She slid into the booth across from him, exhausted but exhilarated. Thank you, she said, for all of this, for believing in something crazy. It's not crazy, Thomas replied. It's the sanest thing I've ever done. He paused, studying her face. You've built something beautiful here, Jean. Something my mother would have loved. Our mothers, Jean corrected gently. This belongs to both of them. Thomas nodded, a rare smile softening his features. They sat in comfortable silence, two people bound by tragedy and soup, by violence and mercy, by the strange alchemy that transforms pain into purpose. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, but inside Eleanor's table, in the warm glow of Edison bulbs and the lingering scent of comfort food, something revolutionary was taking root. The radical idea that power could be gentle, that strength could be kind, that monsters could choose to build instead of destroy. And in a corner booth, a former waitress and a mafia boss sat together, silent witnesses to the beautiful, improbable thing they'd created from the ruins of who they used to be. 1 year later, Eleanor's table had become a city landmark. Food critics called it transformative, and a masterclass in hospitality as activism. Local news ran features on Jean's pay-forward board, which had funded over 2,000 free meals. The restaurant employed 37 people, most of them pulled from the margins society had discarded. 3 former servers had been promoted to management. 2 cooks had opened their own food trucks with loans Jean had personally guaranteed. But more than success, Eleanor's table had become a symbol. In a city defined by inequality and ruthless ambition, it represented the possibility of something different. Not charity, but dignity. Not handouts, but hands up. Jean had changed too. The woman who'd once knelt on a restaurant floor begging not to be kicked now walked with quiet authority. She'd been featured in magazines, invited to speak at hospitality conferences, courted by investors wanting to franchise her model. She'd refused them all. Eleanor's table wasn't a brand to be replicated. It was a promise to be protected. Marcus, now 9, sometimes did homework in Jean's office after school. He'd met Thomas dozens of times, always respectful, always kind, treating the boy like he mattered in a way his biological father never had. Marcus had stopped asking why Mr. Thomas always sat at the same table, why people sometimes whispered when he walked in. He just knew that this man made his mom smile in a way she hadn't before. On this particular Tuesday evening, during the quiet hour between lunch and dinner service, a well-dressed businessman entered Eleanor's table. Jean recognized the type: immediately expensive suit, aggressive posture, the air of someone used to being obeyed. He sat at a table near the window and snapped his fingers at a young server named Sophia. Water. Now. No ice. Sophia, 23, and still learning to navigate customer dynamics, hurried over with a pitcher. Her hands trembled slightly. She'd been homeless 6 months ago, and loud voices still triggered her. As she poured, a few drops splashed onto the table. The man's face darkened. Are you incompetent? Look at this mess. Sophia apologized immediately, reaching for a towel. But the man grabbed her wrist, not violently, but firmly enough to stop her movement. Maybe you should find a job more suited to your skill level. Like nothing. The restaurant went quiet. Jean, who'd been reviewing invoices at the bar, set down her pen. She didn't run to intervene, didn't shout. She simply walked across the dining room with the same calm authority she'd learned from Thomas Denaro, each step deliberate and purposeful. Sir, Jean said, her voice clear and firm, We don't treat people that way here." The man looked up, irritation flickering across his face. "I'm a customer." She spilled water on. "She's a human being," Jean interrupted. "And in this restaurant, every human being, staff and customer, deserves respect. You have two choices. Apologize to Sophia, or leave." The man laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Do you know who I am? I could buy this place." "This place isn't for sale," Jean replied calmly. "And I don't care who you are. Those are still your only two options." Silence stretched across the dining room. Other customers watched, some uncomfortable, others leaning forward with anticipation. Sophia stood frozen, her wrist still in the man's grip. From table 12, where he'd been sitting unnoticed until this moment, Thomas Denaro stood. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He simply rose to his full height, his presence filling the room like gathering thunder, his dark eyes fixed on the businessman's hand around Sophia's wrist. The man followed the collective gaze, saw who was watching, and recognition dawned across his face like a cold sunrise. His hand released Sophia's wrist immediately. "I apologize," he stammered, first to Sophia, then to Jean. "I was out of line. I'm sorry." Jean nodded once. "Thank you. Your meal is on the house, but you won't be returning." The man left quickly, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, his dignity in tatters. As the door closed behind him, quiet applause rippled through the restaurant. Sophia wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by being defended rather than blamed. Jean squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did nothing wrong. Never apologize for someone else's cruelty." Later, after the dinner rush had ended and the last customers had filtered out into the night, Jean locked the front door and found Thomas still at table 12, his black coffee untouched as always. She slid into the booth across from him, exhaustion and pride warring on her face. "You handled that well," Thomas said. "I learned from the best," Jean replied with a slight smile. Then, more seriously, "Did you see his face? When you stood up? He looked like he'd seen death." "Maybe he had," Thomas said quietly. "A year ago, I would have broken his hand for touching one of mine. Now I just stand up, and that's enough." He met her eyes. "You did that. You changed what my power means." Jean shook her head. "We did that. Your mother started it with a bowl of soup. I continued it with Eleanor's table. You protected it when the world tried to tear it down. It's all of us." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the coffee cup. "I never thought my life could be about something other than fear. But watching you tonight, watching you defend Sophia the way I once defended you," he paused, emotion roughening his voice. "This is what my mother wanted. This is the man she hoped I'd become." Jean reached across the table, her hand covering those scarred, tattooed fingers that had ordered violence but had also lifted her from the floor with unexpected gentleness. "You became him," she said softly. "You just needed someone to believe it was possible." Outside Eleanor's table, the city continued its endless rhythm, sirens and laughter, ambition and desperation, cruelty and unexpected mercy all tangled together. But inside, in the warm glow of a restaurant, built on the radical premise that every person deserves dignity, two people sat in comfortable silence. A waitress who'd learned to use her voice. A mafia boss who'd learned to temper his power with compassion. Both of them proof that transformation was possible. That one moment of connection could ripple outward and change everything. Jean looked out at the dining room, at the pay-forward board covered in colored cards, at the staff cleaning tables with pride instead of resignation, at the empty chair where Patricia now sat every Tuesday for the weekly community dinner Jean had started. And she thought about Richard Hale's cruel words that night a year ago, about being trash that needed to learn her place. She'd learned her place, all right. It was right here. Building something that proved kindness wasn't weakness, that mercy wasn't soft, that sometimes the monsters we fear are the only ones willing to defend what's right. Jean whispered to herself, the words both memory and manifesto. Sometimes the people the world calls dangerous are just the ones brave enough to protect what's sacred. Thomas heard her, and his rare smile returned the one that transformed his entire face, that made him look less like a mafia boss and more like a man who'd finally found his purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Jean asked. "My mother," Thomas said. "And how she'd love that you turned a bowl of soup into a revolution." Jean laughed softly. "It's not a revolution. It's just dinner." "Same thing," Thomas replied, "when you do it right." They sat together as the city lights glittered beyond the windows, as the last candles flickered and died, as Eleanor's table settled into the peaceful quiet of a place that had fulfilled its purpose for another day. And somewhere, in whatever place good mothers go when they leave this world. Eleanor Denaro smiled. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.